Hello everyone, this is Dr. Gabriel Sines once again, covering Chapter 3 for Introductory Psychology. This week we're talking about development. What a pretty picture of a growing plant there. I love those. So, in the chapter about development, of course, we're talking about the growth of people from before they're born through to being a baby, toddler, child, adolescent, adult, and into older adulthood. This picture of Daniel Radcliffe is always pretty interesting because I kind of grew up with him. He's around my age. I'm not sure if he's a little bit older or younger, but it's Harry Potter, and he's kind of it's an important fact now to accept that he's an adult, definitely an adult, and so am I, which is kind of interesting. So major sections for this week. There's big ideas in developmental psychology, pre and post-natal development. So what does development look like before and after you're born? Parenting and love. That's a pretty interesting chapter. And adulthood, this development. Now this section is going to have a lot to do with milestones. And so as a brief activity, I'd like to give you an opportunity to think about what milestones you come up with when you think about these different age groups. So what I'd like you to do is, in a moment, just pause the video and come up with at least one or two milestones for each of the following major stages in life: infancy, childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, and finally adulthood. So these things can be something that you feel you've achieved or that you feel should be achieved in the ages of these stages. Another thing you can think about is things that you believe should or should not change during these stages of life. I'm going to go ahead and give you a moment. Please pause the video here. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's talk through these stages. It's always an interesting conversation to have in the classroom, and it's always a little bit awkward because, especially as we get into the adolescence and adulthood sections, people start to feel pressured, almost as if they mention a certain milestone that they need to get there or they have to get there. And so I hope you can take this opportunity to really rethink these milestones and consider whether you believe they're necessary or whether they're something that you've been kind of socialized into believing. So just to give you a couple examples, in infancy, people learn to walk and talk. They learn to go to the bathroom by themselves. And so in infancy, a lot of the milestones are going to be associated to independence of your own body, being able to do things for yourself physically. In childhood, milestones involve reading and learning to write, learning some basic math, making your own friends for the first time, and coming up with a lot of your own personality. So in childhood, a lot of the milestones tend to relate to having independence in the form of information. So if you can read, you can find information out on your own. You can have relationships that are totally your own because your parent doesn't have to kind of guide you into them. In adolescence and young adulthood, you might have milestones such as learning how to drive, having your first romantic relationship or experiences. Depending on kind of the era that you're in, adolescence also includes things like moving out, getting your first job, finishing high school and or going to college, deciding on what you want to do for your career. There's lots of different things that happen in adolescence and young adulthood, and the thing about this stage is that things start to get a little bit muddy because you still have some of these milestones that are kind of biologically driven, but you also have milestones that are socially driven. So on one hand you have puberty, which is very, very, very biological, but on the other hand you have some of the romantic milestones, which are totally personal, and you don't have to hit any of them, and they're really not things that you need to hit for proper development. So yeah, that's where some folks start to get a little kind of weirded out. Adolescence, the milestones tend to be about independence of person. So at this point, getting your own job, learning how to drive really means that you can be your own person. You're kind of separating yourself from your family. And the milestone there too that you may start to notice, or that is a little bit worrisome for some people, is that they start to separate themselves from their family. Finally, adulthood has loads of milestones. Despite it being the largest age sector by far, it is considered just one section. So what happens in adulthood? You buy your own car, buy your own home, get married, have children. A lot of these major money-oriented milestones happen in adulthood. But in adulthood, we also have milestones such as retiring, such as picking up a lifelong hobby, such as and you do also have milestones in adulthood which may not be considered milestones but may be considered major life events or goals. Or so having a major illness most likely will happen in adulthood. Experiencing some some of your first close friends or families' deaths can happen in adulthood, and in older adulthood you may start to experience certain losses of mobility, losses of mental capability, losses of independence. There's a lot of different stuff that happens in adulthood, and I really want to present to you the idea that we think of adulthood as one big ball of years that lasts maybe 60 or 40 to 60 years, but in actuality there's a lot more stages to adulthood than a lot of people like to think about. Okay, so here's the Milestones Debrief. It kind of goes through some of the things that we were just talking about, some things that I didn't mention. Do you feel as though there are ideal points in your life for some of these milestones? It used to be that people would believe that you should get married at a certain age, or you should have kids at a certain age, and you may start to experience, in fact, people asking you, hey, when are you going to get married? When are you going to get a girlfriend? When are you going to have kids? And in my opinion, the answer to that is always going to be none of your business, because your own personal development is your own personal development, and they really have nothing to gain or to lose from your growth, except by asking you those sort of questions. They can maybe pressure you into feeling like you should do something, which can lead you into making mistakes. Right? You should not get a girlfriend or a wife or a boyfriend or a husband or children just because you feel society it makes you want to do that. Okay, did you feel that there are any more stages than those I listed? We kind of briefly talked about that. As you thought about milestones, did you think about your own life or what you might want for your friends or family or for your children? So consider that a lot of times people make their milestones based off what they think should happen in their own lives. But when you think about how milestones might work in other people's lives, you might have different opinions. Lastly, how did you feel when considering missing a milestone? We did talk about that. It's kind of a stressful thing. So let's get started here with the material. The big ideas in developmental psychology are as follows. There are always nature and nurture aspects to developmental psychology. Everything in your development is going to be based on both nature, aspects of your biology and genetics, and nurture, your experiences. So I spoke about puberty being a totally biological process, and yes, that is true, but your experiences can affect it too, such as how good your nutrition is. Continuity and stages. So this is the idea that everything in our lives is actually a continuous set of events. There's no one period where we suddenly wake up and we are children instead of a toddler. There's no time that we wake up and suddenly are responsible instead of irresponsible. That being said, despite everything being on a continuity, there are definitely stages that we can talk about. These stages are beneficial for us because they're helpful in simplifying information and working with information in our world. So as we go through this chapter, I'd like you to be thinking about, well, what things in our lives are actually continuous that we assumed are discrete stages, and what things in our lives can we think about in stages just to help us understand how they work. Lastly, stability and change may seem similar to continuity and stages, but I promise it's completely different. The idea behind stability and change is that there are some things in our lives that are consistent, and some things that change over time. And you may be surprised to see which things are consistent and which things change. In actual fact, just about nothing is consistent in our lives. Everything changes over and the thing is that everything has different periods of time in which things change. For example, it takes somewhere between 7 to 11 years for our bodies to completely be replaced, to have completely new cells in every part of our body. And while we have the same mind, that mind is changed moment to moment, day to day, week to week, month to month, and year to year, which means that our personalities, despite being made up of the same, coming from the same person, may be completely different depending on our circumstances or the part of the lives that we're living in. So, like I said earlier, there's really almost nothing in our worlds almost nothing in our worlds is totally stable, but the rate at which things change can be something that we can hold on to. And so some things in our personality are more stable than others. Okay, so the next couple pages just go into just a little bit more detail about these major topics. So the idea of nature versus nurture again, experiences versus biology. So we've kind of already talked through this slide, so I'll move right past it to this example here. I think it's a really fun example. I'd like to present to you the idea that students and professors are really not that different. Sorry, I sneezed there. I'd like to present to you the idea that students and professors are really not that different. So consider the fact that a professor must have been a student at some point in their past. And to become a professor, you actually go through graduate school. You have to get your master's degree and or your PhD or a teaching license. And so I have been a student at some point in my past, and I've been a graduate student. I have been a professor and an instructor. So you can consider, in fact, that while these may seem like different stages of my development into professorhood, in actuality, they are just different parts of the continuum of my learning. You can imagine that someone who teaches is just someone who's learned really, really, really well. And we've talked about how teaching is one of the best ways to learn. So in actuality, despite there being stages in life, most everything that happens to us changes over a gradual period of time. And if you want, you could think about my qualification as an instructor. Instead of being what my title is or what my job is, you might think of it as just how many hours I've spent in school. And so because I probably spent a fair few number of hours in psychology, probably more than everybody in the class, I would probably be most qualified to teach that psychology class. So as a student, you might be experiencing 0 hours of college or graduate level psychology. Graduate students might be in the hundreds and professors probably in the thousands. And so that's definitely where I'm at. At least it feels that way. No, I'm totally sure I've got thousands of hours of psych experience. So stages do not actually exist in nature. New topic. Right? However, stages are helpful in understanding our world. You may notice that if you look at the video at the beginning of the slide of the PowerPoint, there is no such thing as stages of growth for plants. You can see how they change moment to moment in that video, which is actually kind of hour to hour, but there's no point in which you can say that the plant is grown versus not grown. If you're familiar with how plants grow, you can never really say that there is or is not a leaf in a sudden jolt. Kind of what happens is that over time a leaf develops, and the point at which you can recognize something as a leaf, by the time you can tell that the leaf is there, it's already been there for at least a couple of days, maybe less or more depending on the type of plant. This is a wonderful video that shows off a bit of research that lets you see how our development into learning to speak is a lot more continuous than we usually think about. So this video, a family gathered data from their baby learning to speak over, I think it was 2 years. I'd like you to watch this video up until the point you hear the child say water clearly, and think about how that is actually a continuous set of changes. Instead of suddenly being able to say water, the child child practiced saying water over a very long period of time. And you'll notice that there were some stages to the practice. There were parts where they could say, you had no idea how to say it. You can hear physically how the body was developing and giving him a better ability to physically produce the word, but you can also hear how mentally he kind of started to make the leap between his original word for water, gaga, and his final word for water, water, which for a long time sounded like wa-ter. So go ahead and give that video a watch. I'll pause this one for you. 3, 2, 1. And moving right along. So, stability and change, the last major section of this subsection, the idea that some things in our lives are pretty consistent, but pretty much everything in our lives changes given enough time. So to present this idea, I'd like to start with the idea that some people's personalities change over time, but that not some people, everyone's personality changes over time, but that personality can be something that changes pretty slowly and that can have major effects on your life. So here we've got an image of two ladies, one that smiles very brightly and one that smiles a little bit more passively, and there's absolutely nothing right or wrong about how these smiles work. However, there is research that shows that the more expressive smile can have a little bit more positive outcomes in your life. So the people with more expressive smiles tend to have just a little bit better marriages. So only 1 in 4 people with those expressive sort of smiles were divorced, whereas 1 in 20 with those expressive smiles got divorced, whereas 1 in 4 with these less expressive smiles got divorced. So it's a pretty substantial difference in divorce rates there, just from the expressivity. It's probably not the smile itself that's causing those divorces or not causing those divorces, but there may be a larger personality quality associated with that. Okay, so let me present to you 2 things that change over your 20s and 30s. In your 20s, people become more conscientious. And so when I mention that, I always like to talk about your room. My girlfriend just had her roommate move out, and one of the things that was sort of an issue between the two was that my girlfriend's roommate was a little bit messy. Her room was pretty messy. She kept the kitchen pretty messy, and that was distressing for my girlfriend. My girlfriend is 30, so her conscientiousness has probably hit its increase maximum there, or else she's at least developed it pretty well. And so it was interesting to note that my girlfriend's roommate, I think she was 22 or 23, maybe hadn't had the biological opportunity to develop that conscientiousness, that feeling that, how she acts affects other people. And so that may be why she kept her room in a kind of a state of disarray. Alternatively, in your 30s, people increase in their agreeableness. Agreeableness being how you relate positively to other people. And so it may be that certain folks are, maybe more stubborn, more angry, more rude in their 20s, and in their 30s they become just more sociable. I can promise you that my girlfriend and her roommate were very, very sociable, so maybe they both developed that in their earlier years. One of the reasons that I present these images here to you, especially this image of a dirty and a cleaned up room, is because what's going on here is that this is a room of a person who had depression, and this is a room who has received treatment for depression, who's getting better. And so one of the things I'd like to present to you, just for your own personal knowledge, is that if you keep your home or your room in disarray, that can be a sign of depression. Living in a dirty space can make you depressed, and being depressed can result in you letting yourself live in a dirty space. So be aware of that information. If you're feeling kind of sad, if you're not feeling great, if you're just kind of out of it, cleaning up your space can actually help you make you feel so much better. Okay, so one more example here for kind of all the things that we've been talking about already, these major ideas. What we've got here is a graph of people's life satisfaction in the United States. So this is on this y-axis. Higher means more life satisfaction. And this is graphed over people's ages. So in this blue line, we've got people's life satisfaction just as reported, and you'll notice that it does fluctuate. People kind of get a little bit less happy and more happy at different stages of their lives, but on average, people are very satisfied with their lives, and they're satisfied consistently throughout their age, throughout their lives, with their lives. The scale here that was used was a 1 to 4 scale, so the ratings here fluctuate from kind of a peak of maybe 3.45 down to a valley of maybe 3.3. So the difference in people's life satisfaction is not much more than, say, 0.15 on this life satisfaction scale. Now, as a statistics person, I can tell you that knowing that 0.15 number is not helpful unless we have some sort of reference point. And luckily, we do have a reference point right here. It says that major life events such as divorce or unemployment result in a change of minus 0.3 in life satisfaction. So when you get divorced, you lose life satisfaction of about 0.3. That's twice as much as the fluctuation we have here for your overall life period, which tells us that people's age doesn't affect their life satisfaction nearly as much as their personal situations. What's wonderful to know about that is that if you are ever experiencing a rough part in your life, consider that that part in your life is probably rough due to the circumstances that you're living in or the recent events that you've experienced. And what I can promise you about that is that it will change. Happiness and sadness will pass. If you've ever heard, there's a brief little anecdote story where a king asks his very intelligent advisor, he asks, I want you to tell me something that'll bring me happiness in my saddest moments and that will bring me saddest even at my peak happiness. And the advisor tells him that whenever he is experiencing any emotion under any situation, he must always remember that this too shall pass. And so the idea there is that you will always kind of return to your stable baseline. And good news, your stable baseline is relatively happy in the United States. And this red line here indicates people's happiness controlling for their life circumstances. So this one is a little bit different. It shows that people are pretty much happiest when they're kind of 18 to 21. So folks in intro psych class are probably, you're at your peak happiness right now. That doesn't sound very good. And that over time your happiness goes down. But again, when we control for these life satisfaction situations, you'll notice that everyone's happiness is kind of on average better than average once you control for life satisfaction. So people are pretty happy in the United States. Wonderful to think about. Okay, so there are a couple more topics that I wanted to present before we get into some of the major sections of the development chapter. The first one here is the idea of twins. We all probably know about twins. It's good to know that there are two types of twins: identical twins, who are two people born from the same sperm and egg, and they have exactly the same genes, and they almost always are born as the same gender, although there are some circumstances where different gender identical twins can be born. There are fraternal twins as well. These are twins that were born kind of at the same time, but they come from two different sets of egg and sperm. So they really are their own individual persons. They have different genes and can easily be different genders or the same gender. There's no consistency there. The reason I bring up twins is because twins are some of the most beneficial, convenient, useful opportunities for psychology researchers to investigate the effect of experience on your development in your life. So here we've got a couple of Jims. They were twins, separated at birth, and they were both adopted by different middle-class families. Turns out that they both got married and divorced a woman named Linda, remarried a woman named Betty, had dogs named Toy, and if you actually look up their stories, they have a monumental amount of similarities in their kind of life paths. If you look at them, though, we know that they are both twins, and they're identical twins, but you can tell that they, whoa, is that my voice cracking, or am I just trying to be expressive? It's fine. Sorry. So if you look at them, you can tell that they definitely have completely different facial structures. They have kind of similar smiles, but even the smiles are a little bit different, different hair. And so you need to start asking yourself, despite these having the same exact biology, what happened in their lives to make them look this different? You might not even notice that they're twins. Maybe if you made their hair look exactly the same. So there's lots of different things that can happen in your life to make your body different over time. For example, if you live in a more polluted area, or if you experience more asthma, or if you have more trouble breathing, say due to being very overweight, your facial structure actually grows into being just a little bit less well defined because you have to keep your mouth open to breathe, and your jaw, having your mouth open prevents your jaw and your face from developing in kind of its most full way. You may also develop some teeth crowding problems because of that. Okay, so twin studies are really exciting, again, just because they give us an opportunity to examine how life experiences, aside from biology, affects people's growth and development. Moving on, part 2 in this section, pre and postnatal development. I absolutely love this dancing baby because it's super dumb. But over here we also have a very, very interesting little video that shows the duplication, or the mitosis of cells in a fertilized zygote here, or a fertilized egg that is developing into a zygote. This is a unborn baby that is at this point just a cluster of a couple of different cells, and it's growing bigger and bigger by the moment. Pretty cool to watch how we've become people from this, super basic organism. Let's talk about hereditary information. So there are 3 similar sort of vocab terms on this page, and I'd really like to clear them up here, make sure that we're talking about the same thing. First up on the left, genes. Genes are the units of hereditary information in our DNA. So whenever you say that you have a certain characteristic, or you have a certain quality, or there's something about you as a person, there are definitely at least 1 or more genes acting in your body to make that so. So you'll probably have at least 1 or 2 genes about your skin color, or your hair color, your muscles and your muscle tone, the age at which you develop, the age at which you start puberty. Just about everything is dictated by your genes, at least in part. Okay, so genome. Genome is the whole set of genes that our species shares. So the human race has a genome to it, and it's kind of the ball of all the genes that we have options for. Interestingly about the genome is that just about everything on Earth shares a percentage of genome. For example, we share a genome percentage with bananas. We have about 40 to 60% of the same genes, or 40 to 60% of the same genome. And that leads to the funny conclusion that there are some people who are 20% more banana than other people. That's not actually quite true. The reason there's a range there between 40 and 60% of genome overlap between humans and bananas is that there are a number of genes in our genomes that you can kind of say are overlapping, or you kind of can't say are overlapping. For example, and this is just a very broad strokes example, don't take this as literal, bananas have skins and we have skins. The way the banana skin is made up of different cells, but it has a similar sort of job. And so you can imagine that you could say that there's overlap there in the genome. You can imagine that bananas have different skin colors, and that the skin color changes depending on their age, and that does happen to people as well, as maybe dependent on the exposure to the sun, which also happens to people. So like I said, there are some things that kind of overlap and kind of don't. You kind of have to, it just depends on where you're at, and so that's why we have that range of 40 to 60%. Last one, genetic expression. So genetic expression is just how our genes affect us. You can think of genetic expression as the way in which genes express themselves. So if genes carry a bit of information, when they express themselves, they affect us and they show up in some sort of way. So you actually can have genes in your body that are dormant, that are not doing anything. You can have genes in your body that are expressing themselves, and you can actually affect which genes are expressing themselves. Say if you're a person with a family history of being overweight, and so you have a higher likelihood of being overweight. However, if you diet and exercise and if you keep yourself nice and fit, the genes that may cause you to be overweight can go dormant. And so the genes that you had in your body all along that can help you stay fit may express themselves. And so even though there may be fewer of those, or maybe they are less likely to be naturally expressed, the activities that you do in your life can cause those genes to express themselves. And we'll be talking about how you do have a set of genes that can dictate who you are, but the things that you do in your life also dictates which of those genes are more or less active. Okay, so genetic expression. I love this picture because it does a great job of making it easy to see how these two different people from two different races have formed children with a mixed set of genes. And I really want to be careful here because I'm not trying to say anything that's rude, but there is always going to be a mixing of genes whenever you have two parents. And so it's just a little bit easier to see in this family from African American and Caucasian descent here. So if you pay attention to the noses of the two parents, you can see the father's got this nose that's kind of pointed more forward, maybe a little bit more down. The mother has this nose that's a little bit more upturned. And yes, I know the angles on these pictures are not perfect, but you can see kind of that the children have somewhere in between that nose. And that's pretty cool, right? Because also you can see that maybe there's a little bit more or less upturn versus forward downturn in some of these kids, but it's kind of hard to tell, especially because of the angle. The cool thing is you can kind of see that their noses are somewhat of an average of the two parents' noses there. Same thing with the children's hair. You can see it's just a little bit more or less average, depending. Of course, you can't really notice it on the girl because she's got an interesting hairstyle there, but on the boy you have just a little bit more curls. On the girl, the curls are just a little bit looser there. And you can tell that that's probably going to be an average of the two different hairstyles. You can't see the hairstyle on the man because it's, the type of hair on the man because it's cut a bit short there, but you probably can guess that he has curly hair given that the lady here has more straight, wavy hair. And so it's a really interesting example to see genes in action and how some of them can average together and how some of them can be kind of picked one or the other depending on the type of gene. There are different ways in which they end up averaging or adding or subtracting or whatever and expressing themselves. So our genes are the instructions for our bodies, and they kind of tell us everything about who we are and what we will be or what we can be. So they can construct everything in us from our height to intelligence, our likelihood of being addicted, and even our emotionality. New vocab word here, the word alleles means or stands for the specific version of a gene that a person has. So you can imagine that we were just talking about the different noses here. This person has alleles for a nose that's more forward and down. This person has alleles that's more upturned nose, and you can imagine that the children have kind of alleles for both, and so you may have the averaged out nose there. Okay. Epigenetics. So epigenetics is a really exciting vocabulary term. The reason I bring it up is because it's what we kind of already mentioned it before. Epigenetics is how our genes express themselves or don't express themselves based off how we live our lives. So there's a lot of information here. I don't really want to read through all of it. I don't really like teachers who read their slides, but just to let you know, if you want to look up more of this information, you can on your own, but I've already kind of talked about this, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. The summary for this slide is that yes, your genes dictate who you can be and a lot of what your biological makeup is, but epigenetics is something that tells us that even from a moment-to-moment basis, we can change what our genes are expressing based off of how we act. Our environment can affect us even before birth. So the idea of nurture is much more important than people seem to feel. A lot of times people are unaware that even before we're born, a lot of things can change how we turn out. Of course, you probably know that drinking, smoking, or taking drugs while you're pregnant can affect your baby. Being sick while you're pregnant can affect your baby. In fact, a number of major outcomes in life happen depending on whether or not the baby or the mother got sick kind of early on in that baby's development. Now, there are definitely a number of built-in defenses for your developing baby. Number one, here on the top left, the placental barrier is the barrier between the mother and the baby. It's made up of the placenta, and the placenta's job is to allow in things that help the baby grow, like nutrients and certain bacteria that help the baby develop an immune system based on the mother's immune system. But the placental barrier is not perfect, and it does allow certain other things to go through, such as alcohol, which can be a pretty big problem for a developing baby. The blood-brain barrier is another one that everyone has throughout their entire lives. It does a similar job to the placenta, but for the brain. So our blood is separated from our brains by this barrier, and this barrier only allows certain substances through to our brains. This is why we can drink alcohol and not really be affected by the alcohol until we really start to drink so much that the concentration of alcohol can start affecting our bodies and our minds. The blood-brain barrier is very important because even our blood is not made up of stuff that is good enough for our brain. I guess if you were to drown our brain in blood, it would probably start to decay very, very quickly because blood can be rather caustic. So our brain requires a very specific type of nourishment, and the blood-brain barrier makes sure to only get that nourishment out of the blood. In your baby as well, if you're pregnant, your baby will have a placental barrier, and it will also have a blood-brain barrier. So if it gets sick, there is that second wave of defense for the brain, which of course is the most important part of that baby's development. Of course, there are a number of dangers for pregnant mothers and for their babies. Of course, the biggest one, the most commonly discussed one, is fetal alcohol syndrome. So if you drink while you're pregnant, especially if you drink to excess while you're pregnant, there are a number of things that can affect your baby's development. And people actually say that if you drink while you're pregnant, there is a certain facial structure that your child will develop. Personally, I kind of have trouble identifying that facial structure, but feel free to look at that information as if you're more interested in it. The quick and dirty on it is that fetal alcohol syndrome is caused by alcohol ingestion during pregnancy and can lead to lifelong physical and mental abnormalities, including head and face feature development issues. Of course, smoking and other drugs can cause major trouble for your baby. Stress is actually a major factor in things that can hurt your baby. Now, this is kind of weird, and I hate this because it's best said by a lady, a friend of mine once said, the worst thing about being pregnant is that getting stressed hurts your baby, but that being pregnant is really stressful. And so when you're pregnant, you do want to try and live as calmly and easily as you can, avoid stress as much as possible, as stress can affect you negatively and it can affect your baby negatively. Of course, nutrition and physical harm can also negatively affect the baby. That one's pretty dang obvious. Let's move on to something a little bit more positive and exciting. Babies are born with a number of reflexes, and these reflexes are pretty cool and interesting. Of course, they're reflexes, so they don't really have control over these. They'll do them automatically, but you can check these to make sure that your baby was born totally healthy. Got a couple pictures here on the left. The Moro reflex, when a baby is startled, it will zoop its arms out like that. There's a couple different possible reasons for that. It may be that it gives it a easier possibility to grab onto the mother. If you imagine as baby monkeys, we needed to hold onto our mother's hair. It may also be an easy way for the baby to demonstrate that it's startled, and it would signal parents to come and, coochie coochie coo it to calmness. If you stroke a baby's foot, you get the Babinski reflex, where it fans out its toes and twists its foot in. This is a reflex associated also with being a monkey. So if you stroke the foot, the baby kind of tries to grab with its foot. Of course, our biology is not such that it allows us to do that, but you can imagine that in a baby monkey, it would need to naturally develop the ability to grab onto like trees and plants and stuff as it climbs around. The crawling reflex is cool. If you set a baby face down, it'll naturally try to elevate itself here with its arms and knees, and then while it may not get anywhere, it will naturally start trying to crawl. Same thing if you hold a baby like so, kind of by the waist, and just let it tiptoe on the ground, it'll naturally start trying to walk or step around. Of course, probably the most common reflex that people are familiar with is the grasping reflexes. Babies are strong graspers. If you put your finger or your hand in their palm, they'll try to grab onto it. Once again, that could be a remnant of our monkey past or our ape past. It could also just be something that is endearing, right? So a lot of the things that babies do are designed biologically to make us love them, and having a baby grip onto your arm really hard is so endearing, makes you want to love them and care for them. So this is a list of baby reflexes. Feel free to check them out, see if they're always fun to mess with a baby if you can do some of these, if you have that opportunity, and learn more about them on your own. You don't need to know all of these, I just want to make sure to present them to you. Here we've got a couple pictures of these reflexes. On the left side we got the grip reflex. The baby is startled, but he is strong enough to hold on to this bar on his own. He or she, I can't really tell by him or herself. So that's pretty cool. There's some people who have trouble doing this even as adults, but pretty cool that the baby can do that. Over here we can see a baby monkey doing a very similar set of reflexes. You can see he's gripping with his feet and hands to stay attached to the mother, and this is a funny one. Looks like his older brother has been rude and he's getting scolded there or something. Okay, so let's talk about milestones for baby development. Once again, this is not something that you are required to know, but I really wanted to present this to you just so that you know that it exists. So when we are developing as babies, there are a number of milestones that psychologists and medical doctors have learned or figured out over time. And so what we've got here is a age at which your baby should hit that milestone. So when they're born, they should already be able to do these things. And this is actually just a subsection of a very large table of milestones. There are a bunch of different types of milestones, so not just speech and language. There's social milestones, physical milestones. So I would really encourage you, if you want to learn more about how your baby should develop, take a look at this. So by 12 months, the baby should be able to recognize their name by turning to look if their name is said, understand really basic commands, babbling, gesturing. You really should start getting the beginnings of language by the year of your baby's birth there. So take a look at this. There's a really interesting activity if you would like to put one together, where it asks you to make a video explaining these milestones and putting together some fun examples. So if you have a baby to play with, feel free to do those examples for me. But if you don't, you can probably come up with some creative ways to present this information and help it become learned. Like I said, there's a lot more to this table, so if you want to learn more about these milestones, if you want to peruse them, take a look at this article list from NCBI. Moving on, how can we encourage development in our babies? There's lots of different options that we have. In my experience, kind of the summary response, how do we make sure our babies develop? Well, pay as much attention to them as you can. Play with them, respond to them appropriately. So try to understand what they're thinking and give them information based off of what they're thinking. If you want to improve their physical aspects. Massaging them can help their muscles grow. Role play acting can be beneficial too, so move their legs as if they're walking, move their arms as if they're hugging or grabbing things, move their face and body to help them perform the actions that they need to perform as they start to grow up. Of course, in communication, there is a number of ways that we can encourage development. Baby speak is something that people kind of naturally do when they talk to babies, and there are good and bad aspects to baby speak. So you do want to use a very expressive tone. So the sing-song tone that includes a lot of emotionality to it, that's very beneficial because that actually is information that your baby can perceive. However, babbling or using words that are kind of screwed up, like boo boo, I whoop 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 you, I whoop 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 you, that's not very beneficial because the baby will have trouble learning what pieces of information are good to take on and what pieces of information are just play. So if you're going to communicate to your baby, use that emotionality, use a sing-song voice, but also speak clearly and speak to them as if they were an adult. When they're babies, they don't understand any of the language specifically, so you don't need to simplify information to them, which means that enunciating and pronouncing things and using proper forms of speech will help your baby learn very quickly. Lastly, social and intellectual development. You can always improve your baby's intellectual development by interacting with them often and in varied ways. So doing things that the baby can copy is super beneficial. Why is copying beneficial? Well, we actually have a special type of neuron in our bodies, and a lot of animals have these special type of neurons. They're called mirror neurons, and these mirror neurons' job is to copy what they see. So if you want to think of monkey see, monkey do, you'll notice that in people see and people do. Mirror neurons that exist in our minds and in the minds of monkeys and apes are designed to copy things that we see, and they are vital for learning. Mirror neurons activate themselves when we see other people doing things. They also activate themselves when we hear people talking. They activate themselves when we imagine doing things, and they also activate themselves in empathetic situations. So if you've ever seen someone get hurt and you kind of feel their pain, if you have ever spoken to someone and they're relating a sad story and you can feel their pain, that's part of your mirror neurons helping you feel that empathy. Here I've got a very cool, funny video of an orangutan who has learned to use a rag to wash his face. Feel free to go ahead and click on that video, watch it. It's so interesting to see how he acts, and I believe in the video he also kind of shoos another orangutan away because he kind of wants to do the same thing, but it was with his rag. Get your own rag there, Mr. Ape. Okay, so next up, we have a number of stages of development that we're going to be talking about. And I think I'm going to pause the video here, but before I pause the video, I'd like to encourage you to watch this video. This video presents Piaget's stages of development, which are a series of cognitive milestone conservation tasks. Oh boy, those are a lot of words. Let's break them down. Piaget's stages of development are a series of stages of development, kind of like the milestones. Here's the list here for you. It includes the sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational stages, and they each demonstrate how well a child has understood kind of logic and consistency in our world. The cognitive milestones are those stages that we just talked about, so you can consider these cognitive milestones, and they are found via conservation tasks. Sorry, a couple more sneezes there. You'll see these tasks in action in these two videos here, which I really encourage you to watch before you watch the next video in this class series. You'll notice that the conservation tasks are all about testing children's understanding of the conservation of matter. The fact that if a solid object or a fluid object exists, it's not going to suddenly become more or less just because you've manipulated it a little bit. That'll make a lot more sense once you watch those videos. And if you want to summarize what Piaget's stages of development are, or Piaget's stages of cognitive development, they're really all about testing how well do children understand or learn their logical thinking. You'll notice that over the course of these different ages, they not only get better at understanding the world around them, but they also get better at communicating the ideas that they have. And in fact, confusion in communication, being unable to really say what you're thinking, is an indication that the child is developing a newer stage of these cognitive development classifications, and that they just haven't quite hit that stage yet. So once again, I'm going to finish the video here just because it's getting a little bit long, and I'd really like to encourage you to go ahead and check out these stages of development, and I'll catch you next time.